presentation is brought to you by Winston Preparatory School and NVLD Project collaboration. We're going to briefly talk about nonverbal learning disabilities, or NVLD, what you might see in the classroom, and some tips to support the learning of a student with NVLD. So what is a nonverbal learning disorder? It's a specific learning disability, neurological in origin. It's a pervasive and overlapping school and social problem involving persistent deficits in processing and integrating spatial information. Characterized by difficulties with reasoning and comprehension, socialization and communication, visual spatial tasks, mathematics, and/or executive functions. Assets frequently include auditory perception, rote verbal memory, and detail recall. Social emotional deficits include adaptation to novelty, social competence, emotional stability, and activity level. Kids who have NVLD do not have trouble decoding language, reading, or learning information in a rote way. A student with NVLD struggles with understanding information, relationships, concepts, ideas, patterns. These right hemispheric deficits can affect a child's ability to do a variety of things: physical coordination, social interaction, problem solving, organizing thoughts, planning. All of these things can be challenging. They seem very different, but each area requires the ability to recognize patterns or concepts and then apply them to new situations. It's important to understand that severity varies. You might see one student who is extremely high functioning, but socially awkward, a little clumsy, disorganized, the absent-minded professor type. Other students are more pervasively affected, and they function with more difficulty in many areas, struggling to learn everything that doesn't involve rote memorization or literal understanding. And then there's everyone in between. Many students with NVLD can do well enough in elementary school because they're very good at memorization and rote learning. It's common for them to run into trouble towards the end of elementary school or beginning of middle school when their difficulty with the higher order reasoning, figuring out the main idea, the details, the relationships, cause them to fall behind. Once the focus shifts from learning to read to reading to learn is where you start seeing the breakdowns. Almost all of these students look inattentive and disorganized, especially as they get older. The more that schoolwork, math concepts, and socialization becomes complex rather than rote, the more of those difficulties start to show up. NVLD is largely misunderstood. Here are some of the misconceptions we often hear. Kids with NVLD are not verbal. Efforts are currently being made to come up with a name that's not as misleading. It's called nonverbal learning disorder because it has to do with cognitive processes outside the verbal realm. These students can be quite verbose. They use language to mediate their thought process. These are often the kids who will talk incessantly, rarely getting to the point. They might ask question after question or rattle off a long list of facts as an attempt of making a social connection, misunderstanding the give and take of a conversation. Kids with NVLD are on the autism spectrum. There are similarities in cognitive and academic skills, but there is a distinct difference in the root of the breakdowns. ASD is centered on a social pragmatic deficit. NVLD is due largely to a visual spatial deficit. Kids with NVLD don't have trouble in school because of their knowledge base. The majority of school, both academic and social realm, is largely reliant on understanding connections. Just because they can remember dates and names in history doesn't mean they understand why historical events occurred, what resulted from these events, and the relationships between the people and the events. Understanding the relationships between the facts is more crucial of a skill than simply memorizing facts. Kids with NVLD are not trying hard enough to be social. Actually, some students with NVLD are the kids who might be thought of as trying too hard. Because they miss the nuance of social interactions, they often miss the mark, coming off as awkward or invasive. There are also the kids you'll see sitting by themselves in the corner. They want desperately to join in on the fun, but they just don't know how. They don't know how to physically join a group of people, where or how to stand, and they don't know what to say or how to act once they're there. Kids with NVLD are just being stubborn. Students with NVLD can be cognitively rigid, which might look like stubbornness. They adhere to a rigid schema because that's what they can do. Being adaptive and flexible is difficult when you can't read a situation or recognize patterns, whether it's working on a math problem or responding to a social interaction. Kids with NVLD are just lazy. As babies, these children will watch and observe more than interact with their environment. They feel more comfortable simply being told the label of things than making things happen and learning from actions. They aren't lazy, they just don't know how to act. As they reach school age, they might look hyperactive, but as they get older, especially in the high school range, they tend to begin withdrawing after years of not getting it and not knowing why. And lastly, kids will outgrow NVLD. Neurological in origin, this is not something that is outgrown. In fact, as people with NVLD age, we see increasingly significant deficits in the social-emotional realm. They have pronounced difficulty with social relationships, a key factor in determining whether or not one succeeds in life, as well as continued difficulty with reasoning and comprehension, visual spatial skills, mathematics, and executive functions. These skills aren't just limited to performance in school. These are skills you need to be a successful adult. Each of their strengths is tied to their ability to recall rote information. NVLD students typically have strong decoding and encoding skills. Occasionally, we'll see a student who struggled a bit to learn to read at the very early stages, but once they're taught the code, they quickly take off. They're good at mimicking and playing a role. If you're not careful, it's easy to be fooled and think they're understanding what's going on. They can be good at looking like a good student, going through the motions of looking busy and engaged, when they're actually completely lost, unsure of what the point of an assignment or task is beyond getting to the end of the page. They can repeat information back to you, but often it's similar to parroting, as they aren't processing the meaning of the message. They can recall information read word for word and repeat it back to you when asked, but they have difficulty making sense of the information beyond a surface level of understanding. Overall, you'll see weaknesses in some or all of the following: reasoning and comprehension, socialization and communication, visual spatial skills, mathematics, executive functioning. These difficulties are all connected to that core visual spatial deficit and relatedly pattern recognition. There are also important social emotional deficits that are very common: adaptation to novelty, social competence, emotional stability, and activity level. In elementary school, they might be overactive, and then as they age, they can disengage, seeking refuge in less active activities, such as video games. The VMI is an assessment of visual motor integration, but you can tell a lot about how the student perceives visual information by their approach to this assessment. You'll notice in this video how the student doesn't see the relationship between the various lines in each form. I like this example because this clearly illustrates how many students with NVLD think, how they take in information. Everything is disconnected, everything is an isolated item. They can't understand cause-effect relationships, for example, because they just don't see how the various facts are connected. In general, the following approaches will help students with NVLD better succeed in the classroom. Being explicit in your language use. Students with NVLD can't and don't infer information. What typical students can infer from the context of what you're telling them, NVLD students can't. And because they often lack the metacognition to recognize when they don't understand something, they will take whatever you say literally, even if it doesn't make sense, often leading to misunderstanding of directions and expectations. Drawing attention to patterns across contexts, emphasis on making conceptual connections, and illustrating whole to part to whole relationships. Practice in identifying patterns in all content areas is helpful to get their brain to pave these connections. Reciprocal teaching, or verbalizing the thought process. Allowing them to hear your thought process helps them start to understand what thinking is. We need to teach these students how to think, how to learn, to recognize and appreciate that learning isn't equated with memorization. But it's not enough to just verbalize your thought process. You need to be explicit in this area as well. explicitly telling them what you're doing so that they can learn from it. Priming for purpose. Making clear what the goal is for any given task, assignment, conversation, lecture, anything. Explicitly letting them know what is coming and what's expected will provide structure in their approach as well as help them understand what's going on. Students with NVLD have trouble understanding visual imagery and difficulty evaluating visual spatial information. They have trouble grasping the relationships between things they see and having a clear sense of where they are. This can make them physically and socially awkward. They benefit from rehearsing movements, practice getting from place to place, specific instructions on where to sit and how to enter a space. Trying to pair language with any visual or abstract information to support understanding is also beneficial. Higher order comprehension is the ability to identify the main idea in something, the details that support the main idea, and the relationships among them. This affects kids' ability to comprehend reading, reason through a problem, infer information, pick up on contextual nuance, understand someone else's perspective, and write or tell a story effectively. It also affects taking notes. Some kids essentially take down everything the teacher says because they don't know what's important and what not to take down. Other kids don't know what's important, so they take down nothing, and people think they aren't paying attention, or they take down all the wrong things. Students with NVLD need to be explicitly taught how to identify important information, how to take notes effectively, how to connect information, how to process information so that as you're listening or reading, you're connecting it to things you know already, and categorizing information. These are not skills they'll just eventually develop as typical learners often do through trial and error, observation, and inferring what to do. Because of metacognitive weaknesses, students with NVLD often don't even realize they're missing something. For example, when reading a novel, they don't realize there's more to the story than a running list of disconnected events and characters. They don't connect to the characters. They don't relate to the theme or conflicts in the story. They don't appreciate the characters' struggles or triumphs. It's important to build their awareness that this information is there, how to look for the information, and how to make sense of it in a concrete, structured way. They need to be taught the sequence of steps typical learners go through, including how to monitor and evaluate their own level of comprehension in a strategic way. NVLD students often have difficulty navigating the natural ebb and flow of classroom discussions and conversations. They have a lot of trouble shifting from academic work and discussion to humor, and then back again to serious work, even when it's directly related to the academic conversation. They have difficulty not only understanding the humor, but how it's connected to the topic at hand, in addition to generally having difficulty being socially and cognitively flexible. They might even become agitated at classmates for not adhering to the rules all the time and being serious students. These students can be known as the rule police, as they interpret social and academic rules so literally and concretely, they don't understand the contextual nuance of how and when it's okay to bend the rules. Most kids with NVLD have trouble reading emotion and facial cues and body language, so they often don't know what's going on in social interactions. They miss the social patterns that other kids pick up on automatically, so they don't know what's appropriate behavior in a given situation. Students with NVLD often have difficulty understanding tone and facial expressions on others and don't understand the importance of conveying meaning through nonverbal means themselves. They might appear passive or expressionless, stone-faced, or when they speak they might be a bit monotonous, but their facial expressions and tone often don't match their emotions or intent. They just don't understand how and why it's important to convey emotions through facial expressions, body language, and tone. These concepts need to be taught explicitly. They need to be taught in a concrete way why this is important and how to do it. They can be easy targets as they miss the nuance of social context, and they might get made fun of because of their difficulty with novel situations, concrete interpretations, anxiety and low self-esteem, and rigidity. Difficulties with social communication is one reason why kids with NVLD often focus, sometimes obsessively, on technology. In social media or in video games, it's easier to get by not processing the nonverbal information, but obviously this can lead to trouble, especially in the social media realm. Many kids with NVLD are very good at rote learning, and they're able to do well in math just by memorizing information. But ultimately, that's not what math is about. As they get older, they struggle to solve more advanced mathematical problems that are based on recognizing concepts and patterns. Even with a problem they've seen before, if it's approached differently or modified slightly, they have trouble recognizing it and applying what they know in a flexible manner. It's important when introducing mathematical concepts, especially visually based concepts like parallel lines or the concept of a right triangle, that you offer many examples, especially ones that aren't perfect. Show examples of right triangles that are balanced on a point, or parallel lines that aren't equal in length, or a set of 3 parallel lines rather than just 2. Overall, understanding underlying mathematical concepts is challenging for students with NVLD because they don't understand foundational concepts such as more and less, greater than less than, fraction applications, and conservation of quantity. Furthermore, successful math users search for patterns and relationships and think about connections, things that are inherently a struggle for our students with NVLD. Executive functions are a set of skills we use constantly to organize our thinking, plan and carry out actions, and figure out how to solve problems. Most kids with NVLD have weaknesses in these organizing and planning functions. For instance, they struggle with breaking down a project into smaller pieces or conceiving steps that need to be taken to get something done. If they don't understand the part-to-whole relationship, how could they be expected to understand how to break down a task into manageable steps, whether it's completing a research paper, solving a multi-step math problem, or simply making social plans? It's helpful to provide lessons on how to break down complex or long-term assignments within content classes. It's not effective to teach these executive function skills in a separate class. Students with NVLD have significant difficulty generalizing information and applying what they've learned in one area to another. Using the same strategy across content areas helps develop flexibility in application. Using the same language and sequences allows for the opportunity to internalize a structured approach to organizing, prioritizing, solving problems, and staying goal-oriented. It's also important to note that students with NVLD have trouble figuring things out or problem solving, and actually, because of weaknesses in metacognition, they really don't know what figuring something out means, or even that they're experiencing a moment where problem solving is needed. We have to help them learn to do that strategically. Help them learn to recognize when they're having a problem and how to come up with a solution. Building their awareness is a key component to a successful approach when working with students with NVLD.